Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sperathought, the podcast that shines a light on the people, ideas, issues, and organisations that are often overlooked or misrepresented in the media. I'm your host, Tom Spare. I'm taking a break from the podcast to recharge my batteries and plan a 50th edition of Sperathought. So here is the Rewind. The Rewind is where I dive into Sperathought archives to return to a previous conversation with a guest. Today, I rewind to the 18th of November 2025 to the show's most downloaded episode to date, Paternity Leave, which was released to celebrate International Men's Day. Some friends had a baby recently, and it sort of highlighted to me the desperate need that parents have for extending paternity leave to improve outcomes for kids, to improve the mental health, particularly of new mums, and to make sure that the dad is involved from day one and as early as possible in the child's development. So I hope you enjoy the episode as much as I enjoyed making it. So here we go. Sperathought for paternity leave. I've been thinking for a while about what I might do to cover International Men's Day. I know, for example, on International Women's Day, the most frequently Googled thing is there an International Men's Day? Which says a lot in itself, I guess. The purpose of the day is to celebrate the positive value men bring to the world, their families and communities. It started being recognised as a day over 30 years ago, although interest in the day itself has waxed and waned over that time. Now, we hear a lot in the media, politics, and wider society about the changing role of men, the male loneliness epidemic, the rise of misogyny, the manosphere, the interconnected web of podcasts, social media, newspaper columns, and forums that often talk up toxic forms of masculinity, a sort of hypermasculinity, which frequently favours male dominance, traditional gender roles, freedom to say and pretty much do anything, embracing the idea of red pilling as seen in the Matrix film. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland. Now, the debate that's spewed up by the manosphere is often folded into the culture wars, so railing against wokeism and trans rights, women's rights, equal rights, and cites an expanded role for women in traditionally male-dominated environments such as, sport, politics, and media as a threat to men. These viewpoints have propagated what's called incel culture amongst a lot of men. So incel culture is sort of communities of men online who feel unable to find a romantic or sexual partner, sometimes leading to feelings of deep frustration and resentment of both women and men who have had greater romantic success. People like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson are key players in this movement. They frame a narrative that men are losing out to women and they need to take back control over their lives, reinforcing resentment and pushing a lot of men into isolation, making them vulnerable to influence and often cause violence too. Today, in the UK and worldwide, the vast majority of crime, violence and abuse is committed by men. Take domestic violence as an example. The vast majority of perpetrators are male, especially in the UK. So according to the Office of National Statistics, the victim was female in 72.5% of domestic abuse-related crimes in the year ending March 2024. And over 600,000 arrests in the UK were male, meaning that 84% of all arrests were male in the UK, according to data published by Statistica. Now, these statistics are shocking. They could make an episode in themselves. I could also talk about men taking responsibility for their emotions, their anger, their frustration, and encourage them to seek support. I think we have to recognise the sad truth that a lot of the world's ills are caused by men. Equally, I don't sign up to that idea that there's this sort of binary world, that we either ask men to double down on where they are at the moment, as Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson would say, on the one hand, or repeat over and over again how men are failing society, women, and children. I like to think this podcast isn't just about identifying issues, injustices, or shortcomings, but also about discussing the solutions too. And this is where the subject of paternity leave comes in. So a few weeks back, I saw my friends Paul and Lucy, who recently new parents, had shared posts by the Dad Shift. The Dad Shift is a group of men, dads, and other parents campaigning for better paternity leave in the UK. And by the way, the UK has the worst statutory paternity leave in Europe, with just 2 weeks. With International Men's Day in mind, I reached out to the Dad Shift to see if they'd like to talk about their work. Half an hour later, their co-founder, George Gabriel, reached out to me, and this episode was born. George details how he got into activism, how the Dad Shift got started, the aims of the not-for-profit, and what you can do to support.
Hi there, my name's George Gabriel and I'm the co-founder of the Daft Shift.
So George, before you tell us about the work Dad Shift does, what did you want to be when you were in school, and have you stuck to that path?
So I grew up in an activist household. My mum's a feminist filmmaker, my dad was a sociologist and academic. And yeah, me and my brother both grew up with this idea that we would play some kind of part in public life, probably being actively involved in politics. And I think I was sticking to that path pretty faithfully. You know, I went to study politics, philosophy and economics at university. But then in 2008, I'll never forget going back home to vote in the European elections, because that was the year that 1 million people voted for the BNP. Now, my dad, as well as an academic, he's a Greek immigrant. And I think growing up, that never really meant much to me. You know, we went on holiday to Greece, we ate great food. But it was only sat there on the sofa watching 1 million people vote for Griffin and hearing my dad quietly say that, well, you know, of course, if they had their way, he never would have been allowed in, that I was provoked to get off the path and go and find out what on earth was going on. So I got on a train and I went out to Barking and Dagenham in East London with a group called Hope Not Hate to knock on doors. And yeah, heard definitely some racism, but beneath it, there was some real anger about bad housing, unemployment, and beneath that, this kind of poisonous sense of powerlessness, that people felt unlistened to, unheard, and disrespected. And yeah, it was that was the thing that I wanted to do something about. And it was just pretty clear to me that, you know, another privileged kid in Westminster wasn't the solution to that problem. So yeah, I think ever since I've been interested in kind of outsider approaches to making change. How do you work with people outside the political system to make a difference within it, rather than staying on the kind of firm path of an insider all the way through?
So what is the Dad Shift? Who set it up? When? And what are its aims? Why does Dad Shift exist?
So for my day job, I work in social media. And I think as a result, I've had a front row seat to the rise of these kind of men and masculinity influencers, from Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan to Andrew Tate. And so I think I saw earlier and clearer than most the kind of warning signs, the sheer influence and reach that these figures were building, and the way they were shifting cultural attitudes really from millennials on down, in quite profound ways, you know. And I had this sense that men from my generation and younger were slowly falling out of love with gender equality. And so the question I began asking myself is, well, how do you call them back? The hypothesis we hit on was that, you know, maybe you could call men back to gender equality by campaigning on issues that were obviously pro-male, but also pro-equality. And that in so doing, you could, on the one hand, show up with additional kind of political capacity and muscle. So you wouldn't just be leaving these fights to the women's sector to fight on behalf of us all. But you could also, through campaigning in male voice, take the microphone back from some of those voices online and give a bit of an alternative portrayal of what it means to be a man in Britain today. And then me and my wife, we had our daughter. She arrived 2.5 years ago. And yeah, I was very lucky. I was one of a small number who get enhanced paternity leave. I had 4 months off from my employer. And that time was just incredibly important to me, to my wife, to my child. And so, yeah, I'd been struggling around trying to figure out, you know, what could test this hypothesis. And there was a real moment of, aha, oh, it's paternity leave. Because I'm one of a tiny number who got that time off. And it was so clear that the current status quo was failing men, but also their families, and also society at large. So yeah, the Dad Shift is a campaign that we set up on the one hand to campaign for an improvement to the UK's statutory paternity leave, which at 2 weeks on less than half the minimum wage is the worst in Europe. But it's also an effort to explore whether we can begin to tell a different story about what it means to be a man in Britain today, one that is proudly and clearly compatible with gender equality.
Who is involved in the running of the organisation? Is it a mix of full-time, part-time staff, volunteers? Who are the biggest supporters?
I set up the campaign alongside my co-founder, Alex Lloyd-Hunter. I posted on LinkedIn that I was interested in doing something in this space, and a mutual acquaintance put us in touch. And yeah, we met and just hit it off. He's got fantastic values and a really complementary set of skills. So he's a digital-first campaigner. I'm more in the kind of advocacy, community organising space. So we really connected and got on great. So we decided to have a go at it. He does this kind of 4 days a week, and I do it with my spare time alongside the day job. And yeah, the two of us are the backbone of the Dad Shift. We are a not-for-profit kind of company. So we've got a kind of small board of some people who we trust. We then have a broader steering group, which sector-based organisations sit on. So from Pregnant and Screwed and the Fawcett Society through to Movember and the Fatherhood Institute. But yeah, principally, Alex and I are driving the day-to-day, and then we have, 30, 40,000 supporters on our different channels online. We have a WhatsApp community of several hundred activists who are all driving it forward in their local area. And yeah, our kind of support comes on the one hand, from a lot of mums who are really screwed over by a system that leaves them unsupported, and by a kind of growing army of dads who basically want to be a more active part in their kids' lives and feel that policy is getting in the way.
What is the current UK legal requirement for paternity leave? What's the average take-up across the public, private and charity sectors?
So the UK has two different entitlements that fathers and non-birthing parents can claim. The first is statutory paternity leave that was introduced 2 decades ago and gives fathers 2 weeks on less than half the minimum wage with nothing if you're self-employed. So that's the kind of baseline offer to the country. It's the worst offer in Europe and 40th out of 43 across the whole OECD. So it is way behind our kind of peer countries. On top of that, we have a system called shared parental leave. Shared parental leave was introduced a decade ago by the coalition government, and the vision was to give parents flexibility over their childcare choices. So what the legislation did was it meant that mothers could share their entitlements to leave on a statutory rate of pay of £184 a week with their partners, whether that be a father or a non-birthing parent. And yeah, this was meant to introduce a kind of equal parenting revolution, and yet 10 years on, just 20,000 fathers a year take it. So we at the Dad Shift believe this is like a policy that's categorically failed, and failed on 3 fronts. The first is financial. Unfortunately, we live in a society where there's still a 13-14% gender pay gap. That means in most households, most of the time, it'll be more expensive for the father or non-birthing parent to move to a statutory rate of pay that's very low, just 184 quid a week. And so in most of the cases, it just doesn't make sense for them to do it. They can't afford to share the leave across uneven earnings. The real tragedy here is, of course, that the pay gap itself is driven by the motherhood penalty, the cost paid by women to their careers when they have kids. And so you have a situation where the motherhood penalty drives the pay gap. The pay gap means men can't take leave. Men not taking leave then drives the motherhood penalty, which drives the pay gap. The second failure point for shared parental leave is just that it's very complex to administer. I work for one of the largest tech companies on earth, and they managed to mess up my application for shared parental leave. So when you're a company of 10 with no formal HR person, it's very difficult to navigate both between the father or non-birthing parent's employer and the mother's employer, and to make it stand up. The third challenge is cultural. I'm a dad myself of 2, and honestly, having watched my wife carry both of our kids for 9 months and then birth them, you have moments of hesitation before you think about, taking leave away from the mum. So the fact that the vast majority of the British leave allowance is set up as a kind of zero-sum game between mums and dads forces us into a zero-sum space as parents, which we don't want to live in. So yeah, this is the backdrop. A terrible statutory paternity leave offer, shared parental leave that sits on top of it, but that's delivered very little change, particularly for working class families. All the research we've done shows that more shared parental leave is claimed in London and the South East than in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, the Northeast, the Northwest, Yorkshire and the Humber combined. More is claimed by top earners than the entire bottom half of the income distribution. So yeah, these are policies that are robustly failing working families and working fathers the worst, and they're urgently needed to change.
Could you tell us what the benefit of extending paternity leave means for families, employers, and wider society?
So there are over 800 employers who offer what we call enhanced paternity leave, giving their staff extra weeks off at a higher rate of pay because they believe in the value of that time they can spend with their kids, and they believe there's a meaningful employer upside too. The employers we work with routinely report improved recruitment, improved retention, and improved productivity when they treat their staff properly at this crucial time in life. And that productivity case for individual employers is also borne out across the wider economy. In peer-reviewed research conducted for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, they found that moving to a situation where dads would get 6 weeks at 90% would, on the one hand, drive £2.6 billion of growth across the overall UK economy, but on the other, that you would recoup 80% of the money paid by government in that extra leave because of the impact on women's lifetime earnings. So essentially, if families are able to better share caring responsibilities, that is good for the careers of many women, and what's good for the careers of those women is both good for growth and good for the taxpayer because it means greater tax receipts. But that's just the economic case. There's a growing mountain of evidence to suggest that proper paternity leave is really important for mums, for dads, and for babies too. So starting with the mums, countries with better paternity leave have lower levels of postpartum depression. There's also a growing body of evidence that proper paternity leave correlates with better recovery outcomes for women after birth. If you set a lot of it aside and just look at caesarean sections, for instance, 42% of births now happen by C-section in the UK. That's 230,000 women a year. My wife had 2 of them. And doctors say that after a C-section, it's advisable that a woman has a 6-week recovery window in which she probably shouldn't drive, be going up and down stairs, shouldn't be lifting anything heavier than her baby. And of course, the question of how she's meant to avoid those things if her partner has been forced back to work after just 2 weeks, or in most cases even less, is just left on the table. To get a sense of the scale of the failure of social policy here, imagine a town the size of Portsmouth or Peterborough or Norwich, just full of postpartum, post-operative mums left without the support that doctors agree they need. That's every single year. So yeah, proper paternity leave is really important for female outcomes, both in mental health, physical health, and their long-term career aspirations, as we've already discussed. For fathers, the evidence is really starting to mount up as well. You know, it's clear that dads who enjoy better bonds with their kids report higher levels of satisfaction, well-being and happiness throughout their lives. But what's becoming clear is that one of the critical factors in enabling that bond is contexts that allow fathers to become competent, confident caregivers for their children. I'll talk about my own experience here. When my daughter arrived 2.5 years ago, she was the first baby I'd ever really held. Certainly the first baby I'd ever burped, changed, fed, and I was rubbish at it. And in those early weeks, you know, confronted by something I was so bad at that was obviously so important, it was just quite tempting to say, well, you know what, she's still breastfeeding and maybe she just wants her mum. And it was only because I was given a decent chunk of leave that I had the time to kind of look at myself in the mirror and say, come on, mate, you know, you can do better than this. Step up, sort it out, get the help you need. And I did. And I became a really confident solo caregiver for my daughter. And in the kind of context of that confidence, I could really learn to enjoy our kind of growing relationship. Today, we've got an amazing partnership. I adore her. You know, the highlight of my day is when I open the door and just the sound of the key in the lock, I hear her shout, Daddy. So yeah, the evidence is pretty clear. It's good for dads as well as mums. And of course, it's important for children too. One really interesting study just came out from Australia where they looked at the long-term outcomes for 16,000 boys. It's called 10 to Men. And what they found was the single factor that best predicted from boyhood whether a boy would grow into a man who abuses his future partner is whether he reported a high level of paternal affection as a child. Now, that's super interesting because normally the kind of received wisdom is that boys learn to relate to women from the relationships they build with their mums. And actually what that study suggests is actually that boys learn to treat women from how they see the men in their lives treating others around them. So yeah, this is part of a growing body of evidence that shows that paternal involvement is really important to both how children will relate to themselves in the future and to others around them.
How can listeners learn more and support your work?
So for any listeners out there who are convinced either of the need to improve the UK's paternity leave or to kind of call men back to this broader project of gender equality that can be good for all of us, yeah, the invitation is open. Please get involved. You can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, check out our website, www.dadshift.org.uk, and join our WhatsApp community. That's really the beating heart of our activism. We've got parents all across the country who every 4 to 6 weeks are taking action to keep this thing salient, to put it on the political agenda, and to move things forward. We believe that we're at a once-in-generation opportunity to change things. The Labour government have announced a review of parental leave that will run to the end of next year. So this is our window, both to make the issue as salient as possible and say, no, this matters to working families, and also to nail this framing that's particularly important to working men, and it's particularly important to calling them back to a politics that embraces gender equality and doesn't blame women for the struggles of men. So yeah, please do get involved. The campaign's rocking and rolling, and I think we're onto a winner, but we need every piece of help we can get to get this thing over the line.
So that brings to an end this episode of Spare a Thought. My thanks to George Gabriel from the Daft Shift for giving us a great overview of their work and campaign. In the show notes, you can find links to the Daft Shift's social media and its website too. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast and hear my thoughts on a range of topics, you can subscribe to my Substack. Links also in the notes. The title track for this show is Young Shall Grow. Credit and thanks to Afro Cluster, Magugu and Asha Jane. Spare a Thought is a Be the Change Media Network production. I'm Tom Spare. This has been Spare a Thought for Paternity Leave. Thanks for listening.
Whether you like them or not, young shall grow. Better fill them with love. Them to know. In this life you don't